Well, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening to all of you joining us live here or online at the Swiss Re Auditorium. My name is Nico Luchsinger, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this final episode of our series on climate change in the Indo-Pacific, produced in partnership with the Swiss Re Institute. Today, we will assess the outcomes of the COP26 conference in Glasgow and what they mean for the Indo-Pacific and the world. Our first two guests have a very tight schedule, so we will jump right in now, and I will provide more housekeeping notes before the next session. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome with me here on stage Andreas Berger, who is the CEO of Swiss Re Corporate Solutions, and joining us virtually from Australia, Kevin Rudd, the President and CEO of Asia Society and former Prime Minister of Australia. Hello to both of you, and thank you for being here. Hello, Kevin.
Good to be with you. I'm in Singapore, actually, but it's close by.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
And hello, Kevin, also from my side.
It's good, Kevin, it's good to be back in this period of time where I can't keep track of where you are. I think it's a sign of things coming back to normal. So, Kevin, you are in Singapore, and you're attending, I think, a larger conference there. And of course, you have attended over the time of your life many international summits, and you followed COP26 closely from a distance. So I'd love to get from you your perspective, your insights in a time of heightened global political tensions. How do you assess the summit and its outcomes? Can we be satisfied?
Well, thank you very much, Nico, and greetings to all of our friends in Zurich and Swiss Re. It's good to be with you from the Asia Society, of which I'm pleased to be a global president and CEO, normally based in New York. I think if we look, Nico, carefully at the outcome of Glasgow, we need to be careful about a glass half full and a glass half empty. The glass half empty first, you're right, the combined nationally determined commitments or contributions from the emitting states at this stage do not add up to enough by 2030 to put us on a safe pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050, and therefore on a safe pathway to keep global temperatures within 1.5 degrees centigrade increase by century's end. On the glass half full, however, I think there have been some significant outcomes. First is, you have, for the first time in 4 years, the Chinese and the Americans now working together on climate. That is an important advance. Secondly, you now have a global agreement to tackle a non-carbon greenhouse gas, namely methane. And then thirdly, what you also have is a commitment by the parties to come back in 1 year's time at the next conference of the parties, not 5 years' time, for those countries who have not come forward with a renewed commitment for their carbon reductions by 2030. So against those three measures, I think we have achieved some progress. And while the language on coal may be disappointing for many, the fact that coal for the first time is actually up in lights, and the fact that we are now talking about having to reduce coal as a primary energy resource, phase it down, if not, as we would have preferred, phase it out, that means that, frankly, the days of coal as a fossil fuel are beginning to draw to a close.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And Andreas, let me turn to you. Kevin says, it's kind of a glass half full, half empty situation when we look at COP26 in Glasgow. And if we zoom out a little bit and see this whole development, maybe starting in Paris up to now and looking into the future, would you say we're on track, or at least we're a little bit more on track than we were before Glasgow? Are we broadly going in the right direction?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And it depends on the perspective that you take. I mean, Glasgow, you had basically all stakeholders coming together, and each and every stakeholder group probably had a different view on things. I mean, you could start in Paris, yes, but I would like to start with the G20. And I think that was a sobering moment because it was so short before Glasgow. So everybody was so enthusiastic, and then G20 came with pretty much a disappointment. And the question is really the expectation levels. The expectations were so high, and you almost couldn't achieve anything in Glasgow. So to your glass half empty or half full, so that's the glass half empty. So everybody went to Glasgow pretty disappointed. The energy levels were pretty low. And then as you were in Glasgow, then suddenly, depending on where you were and who you spoke to, the optimism came back. Now you've got two stakeholder groups, one were the governments, and the other part is the private sector. And here again, you could see different dynamics. What I would like to point to is the private sector. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I found very encouraging. Our group CEO, Christian Mumenthaler, he's co-chairing with the IKEA CEO, the CEO Alliance. And I mean, the sheer number of CEOs who not only were present, but were also committed publicly, pledges were going out without sometimes even knowing what to do with it internally in their organizations. But I think to really go out and commit and give that push, that's really very, very good. And then the aftermath of COP26 showed some very positive tendencies. The International Energy Agency, for instance, said, look, there's no need to invest into new gas fields, for instance. So that puts pressure on private sector, on the financial sector, by the way, banks and insurance companies. So we are being challenged now to say, look, what's our position towards, ensuring those assets, that are going to be potentially be produced without, the need, basically.
And I want to come back to some of the things you said on the private sector. But first, Kevin, you of course very briefly mentioned in your remarks before that one of the positive outcomes of Glasgow was the renewed sort of spirit of collaboration, if we can call it that, between the US and China. We had the US-China agreement that was published a little bit as a surprise in Glasgow, and then of course we had the Biden-Xi virtual summit just a few days after, and you've commented extensively on both. So there was a time in the last 1 or 2 years when everybody was saying, well, the US and China are engaged in a conflict, but the one area where we can collaborate, including Europe as well, is climate change. Is that what we're seeing now? Is this sort of a climate change detente that we're seeing, where as the two big power blocks in the world are still engaged in a conflict, but at least they have decided to collaborate in this? Or is it too early to make that statement? Do you expect to see meaningful cooperation between the US and China on climate change going forward?
Well, Nico, before I just answer that, to echo what Andreas has just said on one point, the private sector's response to the climate change agenda in Glasgow, I think, was genuinely positive. It is part of the glass half full. But here is the challenge for our friends in the private sector. Where governments have lagged and where governments have failed to lift themselves to the challenge of robust targets by 2030 in order to transition to carbon neutrality by 2050. The world will now be looking for global private sector leadership. In Paris, governments were ahead of the private sector. In Glasgow, the private sector is ahead of governments. That leadership will now need to continue. Yep. On the question of US and China, we at the Asia Society, through our Policy Institute, have been acting as a bridge between the US and the Chinese during the last year of the Trump administration, between the Democrats in the United States and the Chinese about what to do if the Democrats became the next administration. I'm pleased to say that exercise has borne some fruit. Is it too premature to say that this has been quarantined from the rest of the geopolitical relationship? No, I think you're right to say that, Nico. And it's not because Beijing has suddenly fallen in love with Washington, or Washington suddenly fallen in love with Beijing, or either side has fallen in love with the international NGO movement. None of these things are true. The bottom line is each of these countries has now concluded it's in their national economic and environmental interests as the world's two largest emitters, to act in order to prevent further environmental damage to themselves, quite apart from the rest of us. So for those reasons, I think it's now become an enduring position. Furthermore, here in Singapore, the reason I'm here is that Mike Bloomberg is convening the New Economic Forum, which brings together the Chinese and the Americans and a range of others from around the world. It is reinforced in our discussions with Chinese leaders, both with Wang Qishan, the Chinese vice president, 2 days ago, and last night we had a Zoom conversation with Liu He, the Chinese vice premier responsible for the economy, the climate change collaboration again figured centrally in the public language from the Chinese side about where they could now work productively and comprehensively with the United States, including on methane. And why that is important is that the Chinese did not sign the global methane agreement in Glasgow, but they have nominated it as a principal area now to work on with the Americans under the aegis of the USChina reconstituted climate change working group. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Andreas, you mentioned the private sector, of course, and Kevin pointed out that in Glasgow, so the private sector indeed played a big role. You mentioned a lot of these pledges from CEOs. Now, you as Swiss Re Corporate Solutions as an insurance company, you work, of course, with a lot of companies from a lot of different industries. Can you give us a little bit of an overview post-Glasgow, which industries are sort of most at risk, of coming under pressure as a result of what's been agreed on in Glasgow, but also maybe which industries see opportunities, right? So how does the business landscape change as a result of this conference?
Yeah, I mean, you can now mention, obviously, the obvious industries, and we're pretty exposed also in those industries, energy, mining, utilities, etc. Everything that has to do with energy basically is an industry that is definitely exposed. But nobody's exempted from it. That's exactly what I want to say. It's in relative terms, they're more exposed than others, but everybody sort of is part of an ecosystem. And what companies are being challenged with now is to, number one, determine their current position and somehow quantify it even, and then define the transition from A to B, basically. And I think that's the challenge, because there's no standard. The disclosure is a difficult one. And we are being asked, we are being pulled into that discussion by various institutions, either by consulting firms, and there's a few ones here in the room, who are consulting corporates and trying to articulate what transition really means. And we are being asked to bring our risk insight into it. Yeah, because along the journey, during the transition, there's plenty of exposures, risks to be addressed, and then also to risk finance it. But first of all, before risk financing it, you've got to understand it. So we've got plenty of data that we can use with our data analytics and bring the insights into the discussion. That's, I think, the thing that we can contribute, and there's no one size fits all. So it's really, even within one industry sector, each corporate is different and each transition is different. That makes it so complicated. It's a major task. I mean, there's a lot of work and good income for consulting firms, definitely, but it's a real problem. And the question is really whether you can achieve what you promised. Mm-hmm. There is going to be a lot of pressure, and not only from within the companies, because people have to work towards that goal, but also from other pressure groups. NGOs will raise their voice, and I'm sure we're going to come to the point of liabilities and litigation potentials. That's a real, we'll call it threat, but reality. Yeah.
Let's actually, I was going to ask you about that. So let's talk about the litigation threat. Has it increased after Glasgow, and what do you think, if it did increase, what will be the effect sort of on the global business landscape? Are we going to see litigation as a key driver of responding to climate change, and if so, is that a good thing? Maybe.
Well, yeah, I don't think it has increased after Glasgow. It was there already. Yeah? So you could see it coming up. So the trends that you see is that litigation firms who are specialized in this field, they are targeting governments, very interesting to see, and they're also targeting large corporates. That is an uncertain ground, so because the legal frameworks are pretty much diverse in the world, but I think there are a few litigations going on. We've seen it in Asia, New Zealand, etc. So I think it's a reality, and if you look at a web page, for instance, like Client Earth, then you can definitely see the mechanics behind that. So that's a professional approach towards litigation. And large corporates have to get ready for it. They're very exposed. The individuals, the CEOs are exposed. So that's something to manage, to deal with. You can't just stand there and not do anything. That's a reality, and you have to prepare yourself. And We have definitely, we're observing the situation, because as you see this increasing, you ask yourself whether that's been included into the expectations of insurance, for instance, insurance covers. At the moment, not. So that's something that definitely will have to be addressed. Yeah? So that's a technical issue, but it comes with an exposure, and exposure definitely needs to be managed and risk financed. So let's see. The Shell example was a very good one too. Yeah. So it's a European case. Europe is almost a hotspot in this area. It's not only because of the difference in litigation system. It's also because Europe has a different attitude also towards sustainability, very outspoken, and I think you can see it here very clearly. Yeah?
Kevin, Andreas, of course, mentioned litigation towards private companies. He also said that governments are sometimes being targeted as well. What's your assessment? Is litigation sort of on a global level going to be something that we're going to be seeing more often? And does it have the potential to actually accelerate the transition, or maybe even be a disruptive force? How should we think about that?
I think, Andreas, what happened at Glasgow in the lead up to it was that whatever happened between governments and official delegations on the floor at Glasgow, global public opinion, in my judgment, reached a tipping point on the overall climate change, climate action question. And I'm someone who started attending these international conferences in 2007 as Conference of the Parties in Bali. I was at Copenhagen in 2009, where sometimes you felt like a voice crying in the wilderness. 2015 was where we achieved a significant breakthrough at Paris. But by the time we've reached Glasgow now, this decade-long process has now reached its natural tipping point in terms of global public opinion. Secondly, what that means is, as Andreas has rightly pointed out, I don't believe any corporation is now possibly not susceptible to being pressured by a combination of shareholders and stakeholders, and frankly also national regulators, on the question of climate change action. And even if the regulators are induced not to, and even if the stakeholders are deemed to be irrelevant, let me tell you, the shareholders are not. And they're going to be active, whether it's in energy firms or the financial firms which give finance to energy firms, and others engage with significant emissions. Thirdly, on the question of litigation, I think you're right to point out we're at the beginning of this curve, and there are professional advisory units and firms operating now around the world, of which mention has been made of just one in terms of Project Earth, or Client Earth. In Australia, one small example, a bunch of high school kids recently lodged a case before, I think, the federal court in Australia against the federal government's environment minister on a particular action taken on a particular coal mine. And the judge granted those high school kids, some half a dozen of them, legal standing in order to advance the case. Now, this is round one in what will be a multi-level, multi-layered, complex legal process. But when you start to see that happening in the Australian jurisdiction, reference was just made in New Zealand and elsewhere, I think we're at the beginning of this course of action. People may like Greta, they may loathe Greta. My argument is simply Greta reflects the angry voice of young people around the world who believe that my generation has not done nearly enough to protect them from the environmental hazards of climate change during the course of their lives, which takes them through to the end of this century. Therefore, I think we are just at the very beginning of the legal process, having just reached the tipping point in the public opinion process.
Thank you, Kevin. We talked a lot, of course, today about what's happened in Glasgow at COP26, and that's kind of the idea here. But we also have to keep in mind that in past conferences, one of the issues was that there was a lot more pledged at the conference than afterwards actually happened. So, Kevin, let me put this to you first. If we look at the pledges from Glasgow, from COP26, and as you said at the very outset, this is a kind of a glass half full, glass half empty situation. What will need to happen over the next 12 to 18 months to ensure that we're actually continuing on a path that, let's put it this way, is right now sort of mildly positive? How can we avoid the danger of these pledges being out there? Everybody feels good about themselves, but then the global conversation moves on to something else. And come next year, when the next COP is taking place, we stand here and we realize that most of these pledges haven't been met. How can we address that danger? How can we hold leaders, whether it's government leaders or leaders from private companies, accountable to actually follow up on all the things they've promised to do in Glasgow?
I think the critical barometer to observe is what happens in 12 months' time with the aggregation of the nationally determined commitments or contributions to greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. You see, governments may lie, politicians may lie, dare I say it, some corporations may even lie. Guess what? The planet doesn't lie. It produces its own data, and that data is expressed either through temperature increases, catastrophic and extreme weather events, which our friends in the insurance industry have already priced in terms of the cost of premiums, together with other significant consequences vis-a-vis food production, water scarcity, and the rest. So the mobilization of global public opinion, I believe in the next 12 months, will not slacken off. It will be targeted on countries like China, like India, like my own Australia under the current Conservative government, which have not risen to the challenge of renewing and improving their 2030 carbon reduction commitment. The second thing I think for us to focus on, Nico, is this. The renewable energy revolution, through major investments in technology, has achieved remarkable breakthroughs in the last decade since I first sought to bring in a carbon price into Australia back in 2009. Back then, when we were mandating a renewable energy target for the country, the cost per unit of energy production from renewables was significantly higher than what could be achieved through hydrocarbons and through coal. Now, you start to have price comparability. We need to continue to drive both the price of renewables down, plus the reliability of renewable energy supply up, in order to achieve the aggregate energy transformation. That is a work in progress. And finally, to look at what is now produced on the non-carbon GHGs, greenhouse gases. And that's where the methane agenda, both in agriculture and in mining, becomes critical. Now watch this space for agriculture, currently representing about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you very much. We only have very brief time left on this first session. So Andreas, very briefly, your take over the next 12 months. What are the indicators you're looking for to sort of track whether we're going in the right directions? What should we, as a general audience, also look towards now that Glasgow is over and we can't look towards what's happening in Glasgow?
Yeah, so if you want a very quick one, I could say, well said, nothing else to add. But let me just take 2 points. Number one, communication. So you see that we have a polarized world in communication, so not very helpful. So as Glasgow is over, I think the hype will reduce a little bit and people will get back to your work in progress, to back to the desk and work on it. So this is helpful because the reality is that we're still in that energy mix today and we just have to transition to a more optimized energy mix. And what does that really mean in concrete terms? So communication is one point. The second point is we are going back to business as usual in addressing also natural catastrophes, the link to climate change. And that has a direct implication for companies. So we're addressing issues like supply chain issues, sustainability in concrete terms in companies. And this is a day-to-day work. We will have to increase our efforts. That's definitely something we're going to do. We're going to invest into it, and we're going to bring sustainability closer to our core, to underwriting, risk assessment, etc. It's very prominent already on the asset management side. It's very prominent for Swiss Re as an operation per se. You can see it in a builder owner next door. We applying sustainability aspects. But I think that's our job to do now, and measure, get the disclosures right, get an agreement around those, and then let's come back in 12 months and see where we are.
Indeed, let's do that. Thank you very much, Andreas Berger. Thank you very much, Kevin Rudd in Singapore, for joining us this morning to give sort of a first initial high-level overview. Andreas, we know you have to run, so thank you for being here and joining us. And I'll see you both, hopefully earlier, but in 12 months' time to assess where we were.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Kevin.
Bye now.
And I should point out, Kevin did mention the work that the Asia Society Policy Institute has done, has continued to do on climate change policy. You can find it on the Asia Society website, and we can also share a link to those of you that are interested after this event. Maybe one final note on this first panel. As you've heard, Kevin is in Singapore attending the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. There's a piece that will happen, or maybe it already has happened in Singapore, that he's sort of been very helpful on US-China collaboration in terms of cancer research, a big new initiative that's coming out. So that's definitely something to also look towards in terms of areas where the US and China can still collaborate in a meaningful way. Now, let me stall you a little bit while more chairs are being brought up to the stage behind me. After this fantastic introduction, we want to dig a little bit deeper into what COP26 has actually delivered. As you're aware, we're hosting two panels today. The first one will be focusing on the two big topics of mitigation and adaptation, and the second one on the issue of global collaboration and finance. And with that, it's my great pleasure now to welcome my guests on stage for the first panel. First of all, joining us here is Hongqiao Liu. Is a Chinese journalist who has been covering climate change since 2010. She works for the website Carbon Brief, where she's decoded China's climate and energy policy. Thank you very much. She's based in Paris, and she actually returned from Glasgow just a few days ago. Yes, we're not quite sure with the standing and sitting part. You can tell I haven't been on an actual stage in a while. And secondly, let me welcome on stage David Bresch, who is a professor of weather and climate risk at ETH Zurich. He was also from 2016 working for Swiss Re, including as the head of business development and head of global sustainability. Welcome to both of you here at the Swiss Re auditorium. Hongqiao, let me start with you, since, as I mentioned before, you actually were physically in Glasgow at the conference. When you were there, did this feel like you were witnessing history? You know, are you going to tell your grandkids about this eventually?
To start with, I'm not sure I'm going to have grandkids because of the concern of climate change. But I think the feeling of witnessing a history is slightly less compared to what most people felt in Paris. But again, this is still a history that has been made with so many pledges, and I should have shown you the data that, as Kevin just mentioned, the new pledges did, if they could be fully implemented, they had potential to bend the curve and potentially pre-COP and after COP, the comparison. If we factor in both 2030 pledges and the net zero pledges, we have the chance to keep global warming within 1.8 degree. That's the best estimation, with, of course, a range of uncertainties. But that's not enough. And we are seeing 9 to 12.5 gigatons of gap to meet the 2 degree global warming pledge. If this commitments are not fully put into place, and that should be doubled if we want to. The gap will be doubled if we are aiming for 1.5 degree. So in a way, yes, we are witnessing history because we are moving towards 1.5, but that's not enough. And a lot of things that Kevin just mentioned about, the pledges about the coal, about the cow and the car and the trees, a lot of them are not legal binding, which means after making the pledges, companies, countries can just walk away without actually implementing them. So the point you just made about credibility and keeping them accountable is very important.
Thank you. David, you were not in Glasgow in person this year, but you were at the COP in 2015 in Paris, where obviously the Paris Agreement was reached. If you look now back to COP26, is Glasgow a worthy successor to Paris? Does it feel like we are making progress? And I guess, to Hongqiao's point, does it feel like we're making it fast enough?
Yeah, thanks for the kind invitation. Happy to be back. There is an absolutely an achievement in Glasgow I'm very happy to see, and that's the rulebook. Because Article 6 in Paris said we have to somehow figure how we account for emissions and how we make sure that there are no loopholes, that basically countries are sovereigns, but then you have some reason to say, why not reduce the emissions where it's cheapest to do so? But then how to make sure this is not double counting, that people would say, oh, I sell some of my emission credits, and another country would say, we still claim those as our national emissions. And that's absolutely breakthrough, that now we have a clear understanding how we're going to account for these between country ways to deal with emissions. And that's an absolutely stable outcome. It took time. I was a bit kind of uneasy that we couldn't make it in Marrakesh or Madrid. It took longer, but now we're there. And that's extremely important that we bring all these parties together, because no country can basically fulfill its pledge on its own. It's a joint endeavor. And the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, were very much in this spirit. The countries say, so much I can do, but I can do so if you do something too. And now we have this rule which makes that happen, and much more easy for all parties, not least also the private sector, to contribute to that goal.
Seeing as we're of course talking today, not just but mostly about Asia and the Indo-Pacific, I want to talk a little bit to both of you about that. Kevin did mention, that he sees great potential for sustained U.S.-China collaboration on climate change. Let's hope he's right. However, and I want to ask both of you this question: we did see, in sort of the very end of the negotiations in Glasgow, the two largest Asian nations, India and China, sort of working towards, I think it's usually described as like watering down the commitment to phase out coal. David, how would you assess that the role of China and India in the sort of final negotiations, and sort of how worrisome is the watering down part? So what have we gotten now versus what we would have had if these two nations had not intervened?
I mean, the word everybody in these negotiations normally clinges to is ambition, right? And during negotiations, would like to have it as high as possible without opening your cards. And then comes this moment towards the end of the 2 weeks when you normally have to put them on a table. And what's absolutely fabulous, that it is mentioned. I think it's, as Kevin said, it's the first time that it's so clear to say this sector we really has to transform. It's also interesting to see that for the first time in my reading, I might be corrected, I think subsidies are really mentioned. That subsidies might be detrimental to the transformation. Before, they were always under the carpet, 600 billion. Now, in these times, with all the government spending, this is not so big a number anymore. But still, a lot goes into keeping the system where it is, and we don't want it to be. And that's the positive side. It's a bit watering down. We had this conversation. I mean, it's first it was phase out coal, now it's phase down. The key thing again is, where do we read it later in the NDCs, nationally, the countries' contributions, their pledges, how they're going to make it happen? And that's always this balance, this ratcheting also in this mechanism to say, hey, that's my ambition, but then how do I get there? And that's where we have to watch, and that's also interesting, that it's not in 5 years, it's in a year. And that's high speed for the UN system. So I see progress there. Obviously, personally, I would have loved to see it as a clear statement, that's the end year of coal. But there's also a bit of hope there. I think there was a change that it's earlier for some. They committed to really start actively phasing it out. And also, as Kevin said, with grid parity being reached by some renewables, especially solar, it's also easier for countries to do so. But obviously, if you're deeply locked, have your energy system in that, this is a transformative process. And we also know where some of the German energy is coming from. It's not only looking at China.
That is true. Hongqiao, when we spoke a few days ago, you kind of objected to this term of watering down. Yet, sort of we have to acknowledge that, at least partially due to the actions of China and also India, there's sort of a slightly less firm commitment on coal in the agreement. Do you think we're reading too much into this? Do you think it will not matter much in the end? I think it matters, that's for sure. But I just want to add, as a journalist, I want to add a few context to understand and the nuances to what this watered down actually means. To start with, COP26, the presidency doesn't really have the mandate
to talk about coal or fossil fuels. That was not written in the moderate pledge. This is not the issue that should be discussed, that the presidency has the mandate to discuss, but actually they discuss it, which shows a lot of progress, and that's something we need to read into that. And secondly, I think whether phase down or phase out is a technical term in negotiation. Negotiation comes with compromises, as you all know. And in a lot of times when we talk about, for example, Article 6 negotiation in moderate 2 years ago, there was this no-deal situation. People didn't make compromise, which resulted in no deal. And what I want to add to that is it actually shows the art of compromising of all countries in marching towards net zero or keep 1.5 alive. The fact that coal is mentioned, the fact fossil fuel is written into this pledge is a big success. And NGO responded to this that it's not perfect, but we can work on this. And if you just look back 6 years ago in Paris, no one would imagine what we can achieve today. So if we look into this into a historical lens and into the future, we will see things can advance much faster, probably next year. We will have more pledged. China has pledged to phase down coal. Probably, in a few more years, there will be more announcement and ambitions enhanced.
Thank you. You both have mentioned a couple of times, and I want to kind of follow up on that, the carbon trading. So that's the Article 6 is what they're called, negotiations. So there was an agreement reached in Glasgow, and David spoke very positively about that. Could you expand on this a little bit? So I understood from what I read I understood that it's good that we've reached this agreement. Obviously, carbon trading is a reality that's already happening in the world. What will change concretely in the next 12 months or so in international carbon trading as a result of this agreement? What will we see in carbon trading that we haven't seen it yet, and why is that good?
Mm-hmm. A short comment, because my research is on adaptation more than on that one, but I think it's fabulous that we talk about the root cause of the problem here rather than how we later manage some of these risks. So in that spirit, I think the key thing is that countries are sovereign in the UN system, so they have to first all agree. And that's a big thing going through. Then they're responsible, you could not say liable in a strong sense, but responsible for their domestic emissions. So they could say, only what we emit, like Switzerland, it's this 45 million tons or something per year. That's what we really have to bring to the table. But Switzerland imports more than twice as much through the way we consume, because a lot of things are not produced in the country. And you probably also know our financial sector, would it be a country, would be the 6th largest emitter on this planet. So we have about 20 times more emissions through this financial marketplace than we have through our domestic emissions. We're not liable for all of those because a lot of the money is entrusted to us. But in the past, before Glasgow, it was very hard for the financial sector to figure how we can account for that. And to what extent can we link carbon emission trading systems of Europe? China has one. They experimented with different ones. That's also an elegant thing you can do if you're a large country. And now we can link these systems. And you can link these systems such that we can also verify whether these emissions are properly accounted. We can basically, over time, make progress, joint progress, and that's the breakthrough, without going into details, because then there's endless conversations how you exactly set these prices and what you trade for what. But now there's a rule, and there's a kind of a set of rules which allows you to be very specific about this next step.
So, Hongqiao, concretely, would we expect to, the volume in carbon trading to now grow very, very rapidly globally? Is that going to be an effect of these negotiations?
I'm not going to pretend that I actually understand Article 6, but I did study the Chinese carbon emissions trading scheme. Mm-hmm. China has covered the new national carbon market, now covers 12% of global CO2 emissions. It's possible to double it in the next few years if it includes more sectors in addition to the power generation sector. That would be, the iron, the steel, the cement, etc., the hard-to-abate sectors. So what we're witnessing in China, at least, there is a market, even though there are a lot of let's say, it's not a perfect scheme. But there's going to be a market. No, sorry, the market is there. It's going to scale up. There will be certain price that provides certain type of incentive. And that will contribute globally to the emissions trading scheme. I just want to add to a point about the embedded carbon. In my TED talk, I mentioned a data in 2015. That's the base of available data I could find. The embedded carbon that has been embedded in the products that China has produced and export to the rest of the world accounted for 20% of China's total domestic emissions back in 2015. The data might have changed because the structure of the economy has changed, the export structure has changed, but that's significant. So when we talk about global emissions trading, it's not just about trading domestic, counting them as territorial emissions, but also to understand how the carbon actually flows in the global trade. I hope, as I said, I'm not an expert on Article 6, but we, Carbon Brave, the organization I work for, we produce a very great in-depth Q&A for you to dig in after this.
Since we actually already received a few audience questions, and they are, most of them are on the subject of trading, let me just maybe pick one up. And we have normally a policy to not read out the names of the people who post questions online, but this one comes on the name of anti-climate washer, so I thought I'd mention that. I think, David, the question is for you. It has your name on it, and the question is, how do we tackle the information asymmetry problem within the carbon trading market amongst providers and users of the service?
Yeah, I mean, without going technical, and again, me not being the expert on the market, I think what the Glasgow outcome allows us now is to, at least on the level of the UN system, to provide a set of rules and basically also then implementing those, that these kind of what often referred to as loopholes was less likely to happen. What's very important, I think, it's now a moment where those who have acted with foresight, so there are companies, some even close to where we are, who figured long ago, if we have an internal carbon price, we will be much better prepared. No matter what the market price is, we just set up the system so we can deal with this challenge. And probably there, I see also a big link into that. Watch out for companies having an internal carbon price. To once look at the private sector actors and not so much the countries, and most countries are basically constituted of companies acting in their realm. And so basically there, it's also important, how do these companies later report on things? And that's also now an opportunity, because with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, these the companies bring together a scheme which now relates to Article 6 and the rules to say, that's what we've achieved last year, these are our plans going forward, and then you can hold companies accountable for their emissions. And as most countries, their emissions are a composition of the emissions of the actors within the country. And if all these actors put open their books, then there's much less of a risk of loopholes and kind of strange trades going on. What still will remain, and that's a fact in a global economy, the carbon price will very likely not too soon be the same everywhere. And that's because we are different. Countries are at different stages of development, and there we have to find ways to reconcile these differences.
Now, you both mentioned before in your answers on Article 6 related topics that you're not experts. You're obviously both being very, very modest. But David, let me ask you a question about a topic where you're actually totally and obviously the expert, adaptation. So I'm glad you mentioned this before. So we started this series about a month or so back with this hypothesis that it makes sense to focus on Asia and on the Indo-Pacific, not just because we're the Asia society, but also because according to a lot of research, including research done by Swiss Re, that's just the region that's most at risk from climate change. So in a way, you could also say that this risk exposure creates a much bigger need in this region and in these countries for adaptation, assuming that I think the key takeaway here, this is not new, is that we're not necessarily on track to mitigate the effects of climate change fast enough so no adaptation measures are needed. So let's talk about adaptation globally, but specifically in Asia and in Southeast Asia. Now, this is a broad field. Let's start here, David. Are the decisions that have been made on adaptation in Glasgow, and maybe you can just quickly give us a quick summary of what they were, but also can you assess them? Are they sufficient? Are they sufficient to create the adaptation measures that we will likely need given the effects of climate change that we already see in the region and will see in the next decades to come?
Yeah, I mean, one thing has to be mentioned. Adaptation is the easier challenge because it's domestically hitting you. So it's in your own self-interest to better be prepared against vagaries of weather and climate, be it extreme events, be it sea level rise. But that's also unfair, because some of the countries most affected by the impacts of climate change, and they're visible now, just reference to the IPCC, where this is all pretty nicely laid out, or kind of soberingly laid out. And some of these countries haven't inflicted the problem on us. They haven't been big emitters. And so there is this element of justice coming into it. And I think there we are making progress, but we're really not there. And the question is, again, how can you support countries? Some would say, number one, it's money. But I would say it's knowledge. And I think it has also been mentioned by Andreas Berger, sharing risk and risk management knowledge is at least as important as just dumping money on issues. And that's why some would read the fact on loss and damage. So how we agree globally, we deal with impacts, especially for those most affected and probably, as I said, not mostly liable for causing the problem, how we deal with that. And some would say we compensate them for the damage, for the impacts. It's an element to consider, but is it not more important to enable them to deal with the challenges on their own? So that's capacity building. So the investment is not only in just infrastructure and protective measures, it's more in risk management and the governance of risk in these countries. And I think there, the Insurance Development Forum, the Insurance Resilience Funds, insurance has a lot to bring to that table, and it does. The question is it affordable to the countries? So it's a question of open source approaches, are they transparent? These things, they do make progress, but I had expected a bit more out of that, out of Glasgow. A clearer statement that, for example, some of the tools and techniques we use in the, I would say, in the part of the world which have dealt with risk over many, many years in a public-private kind of joint approach, that some of these would be easier or more actively delivered to that part of the world. Again, it's not so much to worry about the biggest economic actors, especially those who are most affected, namely sea level rise, and also within these huge countries, and that's hard for me to even imagine being Swiss and often sitting, especially last year, more or less in Zurich, is that these countries have huge differences within themselves. So it's also the question, it's not so much how you protect the big cities, they probably have the means to do so. Look at Singapore, right? They do a lot to really, with a foresighted kind of approach, manage the risk. It's also the countryside of some of these countries and how you balance that. And I think there, it is, to quite some extent, a domestic issue. And so the UN process has probably more the element of how we share and make sure the knowledge is shared so they can act on their own and then support them in direction. What's really sobering, there are these national plans for adaptations and so on, but only as a minority of countries have submitted those in a way or in a fashion that you can really act on. And that's for me something, when I still worked here in the company, 2008, prior to Copenhagen, we said, we should really understand the economics of adaptation and bring that to those who are funding these schemes. And if you come with a proposal, what you'd like to change to better manage risk, it's easier to be funded than if you just say, I'm somehow out there and possibly at risk. And I think there is still a bit of a connection missing between understanding risk on the ground and linking that up with the UN system to finance the mechanisms and the implementation of the risk reduction mechanism. Yeah.
I have something to add. I agree on the point of capacity building. Capacity building is important, technology is important, making the plan, adapting to each country's reality is important, but money is also important. Money is the first thing, is the thing that is the biggest challenge in adaptation for a lot of countries, especially for least developing countries. And I'm going to cite a few numbers just to give you an idea of what does that mean. To finance half of the developing countries' NDC, just a half, what they have pledged, which is not enough, that will cost us $6 trillion by 2030. And according to UNEP, the climate finance, the gap is $70 trillion today, and it will be 4 times more by 2030. And the loss and damage we're talking about today is about $1.3 trillion per year, and none of this have been implemented. We have not seen money on the table. Glasgow didn't make the progress in ensuring all this climate finance. Some rich countries we did in Glasgow to pledge that they are going to double the scale, but what happened 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, is the $100 billion per year pledge for climate finance has not yet been implemented and fully implemented. And it's not sure the gap that they haven't implemented in the past over the past decade would be compensated or not. And again, when I say money is important, it's because for a lot of developing countries, least developing countries, small islands countries, they have been heavily hit by the global pandemic. And a lot of countries, we've seen their debt, they're in great debt because of just the pandemic. And we're not even factoring the climate change adaptation, the growing frequency of extreme weather events, etc. So money is important, and this is really the time to call for ambition and also credibility, leadership of the richer countries. You can't fail the developing countries again, because this is really challenging the fundamental trust of Paris Agreement and the Glasgow or whatever the Copenhagen Agreement, what the UNCCC is actually about. If you can't deliver that, how can you ask the rest of them to cut emissions, to conserve the forests and ocean for humankind? So again, the point is not about dividing the world to developing countries or developed countries, but we do have realities, and we do have different challenges. We do have different, differentiated common but differentiated responsibilities, and this should be enhanced and should be, fully understood when we talk about all these issues.
And I just want to point out that we're going to talk more about finance in the subsequent panel, so I don't want to go too deep into that topic. But Hongqiao, let me follow up on this last point, because of course the country you focus on, most of your work, China, is still considered a developing country, but it's a comparatively rich developing country. So how does China think about adaptation, both domestically and maybe what role does China see for itself globally, specifically when it comes to adaptation? Is there evidence that China works on adaptation in the region? What role does adaptation play in Chinese climate change strategy?
Yeah, China is also one of the countries that has been hit the most by climate change, according to IPCC reports, etc. And as I said, my job is to presenting the complexity of the issues. And when you say China is one of the richer developing countries, you have to also understand another side of the reality, that 600 million people living in China with a monthly income of $140 or less. That's the monthly income. That's less than the hotel I just stayed last night. The point is the development in China is so divided, it's so imbalanced. And the challenge is that even within China, the adaptation challenge, it's also the burden of adaptation. It's also unevenly distributed. It's also the people who live, who suffer the most from the poverty, from development challenges, who are actually suffering the most from climate issues. So when we talk about adaptation in China, it's really linked, and in a lot of cases in other countries too, with the marginalized groups, with the vulnerable groups, with people who actually suffer day to day with poverty, with hunger, etc., and a lot of other issues. So back to the question about what China has been doing. China is of course, doing a lot. It has pledged to lay out a national strategy on adaptation. It has different approaches that on coastal defense, etc. But again, I'm not an expert on all this. My expertise is really presenting the complexity. For example, in the case of coal, of course we need to phase down coal, we need to phase out coal. But the reality is, how are we going to provide electricity access to a lot of people who are actually suffering, living in poverty and in remote areas? And all this need to be considered in a package of policy. And what we've just seen in China about this so-called power crunch, energy crunch, or power shortage, is that one thing lead to other. The very considerable, let's say, powerful and efficient policy in China on so-called dual energy control on energy, that is controlling the energy efficiency, energy intensity of the GDP and the total energy consumption of the entire economy. It has results. That is a climate policy, that's an energy policy, but it also has consequences in influencing, the production, the economic, and actually people day-to-day heating, cooking, etc. And I just went back to the point. China, it's so big. The massive scale is one of the reasons of the problem of China. But it is also one of the reasons that we should hold hope in China. It's so complex. If China can make it, and I'm talking about mitigation, talking about adaptation, there's no chance that we can't hold the hope for the rest of the world that we can also do that. And I think that's the message I really have on this, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much. And we're gonna be turning to audience questions soon. So let me just remind you that this way. There we go. If you are joining us online and you have a question, to please use Slido. You can scan the QR code, or of course you can just go to slido.com and enter the code. And of course, if you're here in the room, just raise your hand when it's time. Before we do that, I want to ask both of you a little bit of a meta question, because we've already gone very deep into some of the things that have been discussed at Glasgow, and they're obviously part of this big topic of climate change. And one thing that just seems to be a challenge in all of this is that it is a very complex topic. And I try to read up a little bit. And by the way, can recommend Carbon Brief, where Hongqiao works strongly for doing that. But it's just very complicated, and there's dozens, if not hundreds, of acronyms, and there's subcommittees, and there's processes. And it seems, you both said, Hongqiao, you said you don't want to pretend to understand Article 6. So it seems even hard for experts to kind of wrap their heads around of the complexity of the process, wrap their heads around, sort of all the interdependent things that are going on. And to me, that seems also like a little bit of a challenge when trying to explain this to a broader audience. It does feel to me that there was a lot of reporting on Glasgow. A lot of the reporting on Glasgow was very good, but still, my overall impression, in the last week or so after Glasgow, I was a bit confused, because I read everything from this is an unmitigated disaster, and we're heading straight to hell, to this was actually fantastic, and it shows that climate diplomacy can still work. So you both were experts in this, regardless of what you say, but you are. How do you think about sort of making sense of this to a non-expert audience, David?
Yeah, the point is, I think the reason that by now the topic climate change is absolutely mainstreamed means it's a complex issue, because we're dealing with a climate system that's land, oceans, the atmosphere. But on the other hand, it does not need to be complicated, because it's pretty clear what you do. You basically change the heat balance of the planet. That's like if you would have a flu or something else in these times. And then you have to do something about that, and that we then call adaptation. So you work on the root cause, and you have to also work on preventing the things that are already in the system hitting you more than necessary. So that's the plain kind of story, and most people get that. And then it also means lifestyle changes to basically get carbon out of the way we produce and consume things. And also that one is not complicated at all as a general direction to take. And that's also a lot of prospect in that. There's this transformational change we need, which brings a lot of jobs, opportunities, and things to do, ways to do things differently. So would we all be not so much path dependent and sitting on a kind of a green field? We would probably all embrace it. Just find it fabulous what we can do on this planet. But now we all have a history, and that history tells us, I have to let go of that, and how do I exactly do that? And do the others do that too? And they're the only one, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. So first mover disadvantage. All these things play into it. That makes it complicated for the single individual to navigate that. But I would say the big story is clear, and then it's also is clear these climate negotiations are jamborees. For me, there's a small part, which is the UN negotiations. There's all these technical terms. When I came to Copenhagen, the first time I've been one of these conferences, I was totally overwhelmed with all these technical features. And you probably know that sometimes the place where the next negotiation is taking place is not announced. So you have to know it through your network. But that's a negotiation trick, to get the right people in the right room at the right time, to forge an agreement on a difficult issue, and then you get back in a plenary, and all of a sudden things are different. I mean, you don't have to watch that, because that's just the tricks you have to do to negotiate. But what really matters for the world after it is, did we make progress? And that's normally visible and measurable, and that's the part that do matter to the larger public. And if I look at it more as an anthropologist, you might say this is a right. We get together, jamboree-wise, once a year, and then people say, that's the end of it. And the others say, that's the moment to change. And that's natural. And if that would not happen, then we would have an issue. Still, we're not making enough progress. That's absolutely clear. But I keep this positive twist to it, the fact that all the countries show up every year. Now also one being back, which we were lacking a bit over a couple of years, does tell us we do make progress. Obviously, the ambition has to be higher, speed should be faster, but that's what keeps me kind of optimistic. Yeah. And then whenever I look under the lid, you get a bit depressed.
Yeah. Hongqiao, you said a couple of times as well that you see your job as sort of, sort of conveying complexity. So how do you think about sort of doing that while also making sure it remains understandable?
So, just in case you don't know what type of journalist I am, I write 12,000 words to explain to you what the national emission trading system in China is like. That's the type of journalism I do. And that's also a type of journalism Carbon Brief does. And we try to present you with a full picture, as full as possible. So you make your own judgment. We're not there to trying to persuade you to get some opinion, to stand on one of the polarized camp. And I think that's very important today. And everyone's fighting their own fight, right? You're doing research, and the insurance companies, I don't know, all these individuals in the room, they have their own fight, their own work to do in fighting climate change. And what I'm doing is present you the complexity, to inform you, to empower you with information that you can deploy to make decisions. And I understand it's difficult. It's just almost impossible to explain what I'm covering, that is China, to the general public in 10 minutes, for example, where China achieved its climate pledges. All these issues are just so complicated, there's no simple answer. And if you oversimplify it, it's possible you get a wrong conclusion. So the earth is trembling a little bit. What I wanted to say is that it's difficult, but there's also other ways to express that. Art, music, there are different ways to convey information, but what I'm doing, I think, is also important, because you need to go deep into it to understand what is actually happening. And I just keep going back to different cases, for example, let's take coal again as an example. In China, China has been the frontier of the blame for coal. But when I talk to Chinese experts, don't you think they don't understand that coal must be phased out? Of course they get it. They get it that they have to get rid of coal because of air pollution, because of climate change, because it's not economic anymore. But what's the alternative? And this is the conversation we're having again and again in developing countries, not just China, Indonesia, and other African countries. What's the alternative? It's not about just about technology. That's important. What is the accessible, affordable finance in place to help them? What are the job opportunity that we're talking about of this green transition? Where are they? And this is important when we convey the idea of climate change, about framing it as an opportunity, as a challenge, or as a business opportunity. You come up with a case that people can understand. And this is also true, when in conversation with policymakers. As I said, don't you think they don't understand that coal must be phased out? But how to convey that complexity? This is a single quest. Coal must be phased out. But when it comes to decision making domestically, it comes with so many different interest groups. There are different coordinations that have to be made within different ministries, governments of all levels, and the coordination from one policy to the other. And my whole point is that I think today we need to go beyond name and shaming. We need to go beyond just standing on one camp or the other. We're on the same boat, right? We're all on the same boat. We each do our own, we take our initiatives to try to fight the fight that we are, the best fighting for.
Thank you very much. Where should we look towards for leadership? And also, where do you see a lack of leadership right now? Who has to step up?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is, and I think Kevin both and Andreas said it too, there's a shift from the governmental side of things, so the public sector setting the rules and the standards, and then the private sector to follow suit. And I think we see a change there, especially handling emissions, where my view is currently that the private sector in many places is ahead and does understand we have to fulfill these pledges, so we better get prepared. And what you alluded to is definitely this big challenge of externalities. And in all kind of economic systems, there is some rent-seeking going on. Unfortunately, people try to benefit from things they don't have to clean up. And the limited liability company is designed such that you can experiment with things even though you don't know all the outcomes. And that's good, because that's progress. But there comes the moment where you have to stand up and say, now we have this landfill. So one answer is, for example, circular economy. That's not easy, but possible. And then it's also the question, you either put a ban on things, you raise the standards, we agree, or you put a price tag on things. And that's where then the leadership comes in again. It's in all these three things. When it's about bans, then obviously it's more of a government role where the leadership has to come from. There's normally consulting with all the players. And when it's more about pricing, it's sometimes you can leave it if the play field is well leveled, and that's a lot to be said, then you can have markets allocating that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the US, did, and that's what the emission trading comes from. It comes from the sulfur emissions and so on, that they said, hey, instead of saying you're not allowed anymore, we have a phasing out pathway, and during that time you can trade, and those who move faster have a benefit because they need to emit less and can sell their rights to emit, and that's a way to internalize some of these costs. And there, the lead is a joint lead between the government, the public and the private, but then there is also the place where we see more and more where private sector actors start to understand it's a strategic issue. We need to phase these things out, so if I can do that faster, I'm later going to sell my technologies to others, I have lower liabilities, and I'm just better off. So it's not an either-or leadership, it's in a complex world, may I say so, sorry, and that's why the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 17, is collaboration. You have to collaborate, and it's not an either-or. And I think that's the key thing to search for. How can you connect? And probably the last word on that, in short, is this club idea. To say it might be not that all countries can agree on the same ambitious agenda at the same time, but some might. And if they do that in a fair way, so people can join the club, then these clubs might have a huge potential to transform. But the bad thing with clubs can be, they might be closed. And that's then unfair to those who are not part of the club. So I see the advantage of building groups of willing, fast movers, but the doors need to remain open, and that's something we should not forget and should always bring to the table. Otherwise, we might kick people out, and that would be really not only sad, but detrimental to the cause.
Thank you very much, and I think it's a wonderful actually lead-in to the panel we're going to be doing after the break on global collaboration and finance. David Bresch, Hongqiao Liu, thank you very, very much for having been here for all the fantastic insights. Big applause to them.
Welcome to the final panel discussion. My name is Richard Francis, and with my guests today, we will be wrapping things up by looking at the opportunities for the Indo-Pacific region following COP26, including the role that will be played in creating and harvesting opportunities by collaboration between government, business, and other stakeholders. Also, we will address how entrepreneurs can unlock the promised finance for decarbonisation. I'd like to introduce you to three entrepreneurs, all of whom were at Glasgow, I assume chasing opportunities over there in this way. First, our online guest. So Sophia Hamblin Wang is the COO of Mineral Carbonation International, MCI, a tech platform that transforms CO2 into building materials. And she's just bought a new house, but apparently has not built the house out of those blocks. We'll ask her why later on. She was awarded Resource Innovator of the Year at the 2018 New Materials Summit, originally from far north Queensland, home of Australia's endangered Great Barrier Reef, but now resident in Canberra. Welcome to the Swiss Re Institute, Sophia. John O'Brien, here on my far right, is joining us in person this time. He's been at one of our previous events online, and as I said, on his way home from COP, where he launched his new book on climate change stories from 2030. From Adelaide in Australia, John is partner for energy transition and decarbonisation at Deloitte. He's also an entrepreneur and has founded Australian Cleantech way back in 2007, so a true pioneer of the field. It's great to have you here, John.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And our final guest, local boy made good, Renat Heuberger, is a founding partner and CEO of South Pole, a Swiss carbon finance consultancy, but plus over the years, many other different projects that he has helped companies with globally to meet their net zero targets. He's also worked extensively on projects in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, including, I think, a 5-year stint in Indonesia. So welcome, Renat.
Thanks for having me.
So our panelists are not strangers to evaluating, harvesting opportunities arising out of all this, so far to date, dialogue, you could sort of say, on transition to a low-carbon economy. But did COP26 move the needle for them in any way? You know, was it, John, a good forum in terms of business? What about these billions and trillions of financing that were alluded to in our previous panel? Has the opportunity structure changed?
So yes, I mean, I think Glasgow was a massive step forward. I think there was, you know, the headlines were around, you know, which prime minister was there, which president spoke to who tweeted who, and you know, and the final sort of, are we phasing out or phasing down? And that got all the headlines. The really important bits for me, though, were all the other agreements between governments, and all the stuff that was happening with business and finance. And as someone said earlier, this was the first COP that was not driven by government. It was the finance sector, and the companies were driving it, and government are there to sort of keeping up. And I do think the sort of going forward, this COP particularly is showing that the transition is happening, it's accelerating, and it's going to happen, and it's inevitable. Where the role of government and where they do need to sort of keep up is actually they will enable it to be an orderly and more just transition, but it's going to be a transition anyway. So some of the agreements that came out that were, again, have been mentioned to some extent, but there's 40 countries sort of agreed to phase out coal. There were 105 countries on, phasing down methane 30% by 2030. Actually, the stopping deforestation by 2030 was an agreement, which I don't think has been mentioned yet this morning. And some of those things are really, really important. But the area that I think actually has the biggest impact, and with Swiss Re will obviously flow through everything you do, is the GFANZ agreement, so the Glasgow Financial Alliance on Net Zero. 450 of the world's largest finance companies, 130 trillion of assets under management have all committed to go to net zero by 2050, but more importantly have agreed to have 2030 targets and to implement that not only on their own operations but actually through their whole portfolios. So this is going to mean the cost of capital for companies is going to change, the debt structures are going to change, everything is going to change in the finance world for every country, for every company in the world, and that's actually what's going to really drive things, and that came out of Glasgow, so that's huge from my point of view.
Look, I'm going to go to Sophia, basically representing someone coming from a smaller company in this. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, John, is the big end of town, right? Yeah. We're talking about big companies. What's it meaning to smaller companies like yourself, Sophia, over there? I've heard it talked about in Australia. There's like a gold rush for entrepreneurs in the clean tech and other environmental sectors. But what's your business opportunity in the wake of COP26?
We had such a phenomenal time at COP26, something that we couldn't have predicted. I would describe it as a catapult or a tidal wave of interest in our technology. So I'll just quickly tell you what we do. I know that you touched upon it, but the MCI is a mineralization technology that converts carbon emissions from the hard to abate sectors and in the future from direct air capture and turns them into low carbon inputs for the circular economy. And we turn them into, at the moment, things like cements and negative emissions plasterboard. So solid products that people can touch and build the built environment out of, create profit and create jobs. And we went into COP26 as one of the 12 companies that the Australian government would feature as technologies that would help them get to net zero by 2050, because the Australian government committed to net zero by 2050 just before Glasgow. So we went over there. Actually, it was just me because Australia was still locked down at the time. So just me over there with a suitcase full of bricks to showcase what we can do with CO2. We can turn CO2 into tangible materials. And we actually won first place in the COP26 Clean Technology Pitch Battle, which was a competition with more than 2,700 entrants from all around the world. And we came out with a first place prize, which was a significant global recognition. What that meant was showcasing in the pavilion of COP26 in the Blue Zone meant that we had just an explosion of investors, partners, customers coming to us to ask whether we could have initial screening tests to see if we could start a project in their sector. Now, I don't talk too much about it, but as an entrepreneur, it's really difficult sometimes to have the initial meetings with investors and with partners, and to have them all just coming to us at COP was something that I had not expected, because it was a real critical mass of people just trying to get the job done. Being Australian, it was nerve-wracking going into COP, because I felt like potentially people would be standoffish, and they would be cynical about whether the Australian government was really trying trying to do climate act. Actually, in the business side, there are just so many companies just ready, chomping at the bit, I would say, just to decarbonize. And in particular, the hard to abate sectors really need help, and they're looking for the actors that are going to help them get there. And so COP26 couldn't have been better from my perspective, but obviously with more ambition from the world, more direction and more oomph, more can be achieved. But I think there's momentum really building in the space, and it's a pleasure to be a part of it. Now, if I could say just one more thing, it's that in clean tech, in innovation in particular, there's the concept of the valley of death, right? It's the time before your company is profitable. But in clean tech, it's more like the latest literature says it's the 4 valleys of death, and actually it's a canyon of death. And so there's a real role for finance and for public money to help technologies like mine through that canyon in order to get to the other side where we can start showing real emissions reduction impact. And so I can talk more about that later, but it is something that we need to consider. Like our technologies don't make money immediately. They need patient finance.
So congratulations on the award, Sophia, first. But does that mean you're not really expecting a lot of private money to come in? You're still chasing government money for getting things, to get through the chasm, so to speak, yeah?
We're chasing both. Okay. So, yeah, there's a lot of public money going to help get technologies from TRL 3 through to 7 and 8. Our technology is at 7 now, and we still need matched funding potentially. But there has been a massive unlocking of private finance in this space. But I would call upon different governments around the world to de-risk that finance as well by turning up and co-funding.
Well, that'll be a question for that we should go into in more depth with Renat in a few moments. But first, just on these introductory questions, Renat, COP26 taking place in Europe, the heart of the old economy. We've heard about the issues of climate justice previously, about what's going on. Is the financing, the trillions we're hearing about, is that going to find in the Indo-Pacific a home in projects that are going to be able to make an impact locally there?
So first of all, thanks a lot for having me. Very excited to be here, especially after this Glasgow conference. I guess my answer is building up straight to what Sophie mentioned in her last intervention. Money is not money, right? And I think we have to be really going away from just talking figures. Just because you announce $1 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, 3 trillion, that does not mean that this money is actually flowing necessarily where it's supposed to flow, because the question is, what kind of money is that? Sophie was mentioning de-risking, and that's a very important topic that is often massively underestimated. If I give you a small example, if you have a 2 billion carbon fund coming into Uganda, by definition, your average ticket size, if you want to handle this and don't want to completely go crazy with due diligence, your average ticket size is going to be 100 million per ticket, average. Now, what are you going to do in Uganda with that money? Who can handle a 100 million ticket in Uganda? Nobody. So, unless, of course, a few massive government, a massive hydro dam, perhaps, or a huge nuclear power station, or something like that, or a new airport, perhaps. But what we need to understand is that if you really want to make a difference for projects like Sophia's and others, you want to back entrepreneurs, you want to back afforestation programs or biogas programs, the average ticket size is different. Plus, you will have risks that normally you can take. if in Uganda you have to be, for starters, you have to be able to lend in shilling instead of dollars, because if you lend in dollars, somebody's going to carry that currency risk, which is already breaking many deals. So my point is, we have to really move away from only talking figures and be much more specific. What kind of instruments do we have here? And that conversation is still to be had. Arguably, 1 billion of concessional domestic lending is probably more impactful than 100 billion of classic funding.
Look, we'll come back to that, but I want to move on. You know, we've got two areas here. We're looking at finance, but also at collaboration, and we had some good foreshadowing there from the last panel. I mean, all of our panelists have had a lot of experience in this space with collaborating with different stakeholders, but you know, it's damn hard work, right? It's really not easy. So, John, you know, looking at COP26, all those different stakeholders, all those different players, you know, so many different mindsets. Was there any meeting of minds at COP there from the different people working?
Yeah, and I mean, I've been to quite a few COPs, and they're amazing events because you have everyone there. It's, you know, it's sort of in one day. I think last week or the week before, I was chatting to a 17-year-old on the train from Edinburgh who was going to go marching with Greta that day, and then we were joined by sort of an angry middle-aged man with dreadlocks, and then I went to a workshop where I was chatting to the CEO of an airline, and then I had a beer with an energy minister in the evening, and it was like, how can you have a day where, you know, you've got everything from the student protester to the energy minister? So there's a mass of people there, and I think it's actually really important that those people are there, because we need to have all of those minds and all of those opinions included. And I think the fact that, so outside the blue zone, there were lots of protests, and sometimes it was hard to get in, and, you know, and it was delayed. But that's okay, because actually people, the ministers and the CEOs need to understand that people are angry, and people do, there's restlessness, and you know, and the marching was, you know, it was mostly very peaceful, but it was people are upset, and there's a lot of people who are worried, and that it is a real problem. So it kind of humanises the issue when you have to walk through the protests, and sort of brings it to reality. So yes, so it's really important that everyone's there. And there was one event I was kind of speaking at. We ended up having, which was on the book actually, but we're not talking about that. We managed to get all sorts of people in the room. So I had the global head of sustainability for one of the biggest investment banks, and a couple of other bankers. I had some politicians, I had some journalists, and I had a whole group of people who had been marching with Greta. And to their surprise, they actually really enjoyed talking to each other, and found they had a whole lot of common ground, and that everyone was actually in Glasgow to try and make a difference in their different worlds. And so they ended up all standing around having a glass of wine and chatting and going, oh, hang on, but you work for an investment bank, but you don't appear to be an evil person. And, you know, and you're a protester, but you don't appear to be completely mad. You know, it's kind of, and so that's actually really, really important. And so the collaboration there, I think, it does make sense, and collaboration is going to be critical. And the last bit of this also, I think, is with companies. In my day job, I work with the biggest companies and the biggest investment banks, biggest governments in the world, helping them think through climate and sustainability from a financial and strategic point of view. So this is all about finance and strategy. But all of them are going to have to start working in a different manner to they have in the past. They have to think along value chains. So it matters. It doesn't matter who your immediate suppliers and customers are. It matters. The whole value chain now is going to matter, and so you have to actually start collaborating and working in a very different way, because it's the end product that matters, not just your product. And governments are going to have to collaborate with communities and regions and companies to transition emissions-intensive regions, and that requires a very different way of working and a very different way of collaborating. So to actually solve this effectively, we are going to have to collaborate really, really radically. And I think that's the only way it's going to happen, and I think it is starting to happen.
Let's push down with Renat now into very specific platforms and tools to do this? I mean, there's always talk about public-private partnerships between business and government. I mean, your company is working with building those platforms. There's something you're doing in the Asia-Pacific called Shift Asia platform. Can you elaborate a little bit? And what's the perspective? Where is it going to go with that?
Indeed. So what is Shift Asia? It's in Thailand. It's about electric vehicles, and essentially it's a program to subsidize the change of vehicles from diesel to electric, from taxis to motorbikes to now also including buses. So now what's the interesting thing about this? We have in the previous panel heard about the rulebook, Article 6 rulebook. And there is two interesting articles. One is 6.2, the other one is 6.4. And what those mechanisms do is they allow for international cooperation to unlock finance for such programs. And that's exactly what now happens. The SHIFT program is a cooperation between Switzerland and Thailand, where the Swiss, as you all know, Switzerland has pledged a 50% reduction. It's difficult to meet that only in Switzerland itself. So the Swiss government is keen to participate in emission reductions elsewhere. Now, under this Article 6.2, we are now brokering this bilateral agreement where the Swiss government is subsidizing emission reductions that happen through that switch from diesel to EV, right? And why is it interesting? We talked about de-risking before. Now, if you are able to put a price, a real value on the carbon emission reduction, you're actually creating a new type of financial instrument that hasn't been there before. From the perspective of a bank, it's actually a grant because it's not it's not diluting your equity. It's not a loan that loads up your balance sheet. It's essentially a price you get for reducing carbon, and once again, it has actually grant characteristics. That makes it so interesting in the mix of a blended finance approach to such programs. Over the past years, the problem was that pricing was always quite low for carbon credits, but that has changed a lot. You may have seen yesterday we had a new all-time record in the EU ETS of 69 euros a ton, which it's not directly linked, right? That's an ETS, but it gives you a flavor of what the true price of carbon actually is. And I tell you this, at 69 euros a ton, we are actually going to make a pretty interesting difference to those programs. Some programs which have been unbankable and have been struggling now get a lifeline. And that's why this Article 6 is so important to those government-private partnerships, because it's not only about the partnership and about talking and ambition, it's about money. It's about de-risking project with real money. And that's what I find so interesting about it.
It's obviously, I'm hearing more and more the breakthroughs about what's going on, but how do you we've heard about the private side, business, we heard a lot about governments, but Sophia, I'm going to you over there and talking about NGOs, what's the role, particularly when we link it to business and governments. I mean, you're involved in a carbon conversion advocacy group, CO2 Value Australia. How do we bring in NGOs and communities into the equation?
So we definitely found that being a company working in carbon capture and utilization or carbon transformation, that it was difficult to have a voice at the table when the industry carbon capture, utilization and storage has been widely claimed by the CCS community to also just be CCS plus enhanced oil recovery. So my company, MCI, and a few others decided to create an advocacy group called CO2 Value Australia, which is a collective voice for all companies and technologies that use CO2 as a feedstock. Now, CO2 can be used to create fuels, chemical feedstocks, and building materials and other products if you apply an innovation lens. And so we created this advocacy group in order to have some influence on policy and really show governments and investors that this is an industry that it's estimated to be worth $6 trillion even right now, and could lock away 10% of world's emissions. So crucially, it's not a silver bullet for climate change, and I don't think anybody thinks that there'll be one technology that's going to save us. It's going to be crucially a portfolio of different solutions at different in different locations at different times, which is going to help us to get there. So I think that just to touch on your question, is that there's many voices that are excluded from the table when we get together and talk about these things. And it's really important that those who have a voice think about that and consider who isn't here. What are the disruptive technologies that are too nascent to be pulled up? What are the technologies that may need some lifeblood in order to reach the prominence that others do? And so we aligned with CO2 Value Australia, CO2 Value Europe, which is probably a year and a half or 2 years ahead of us. And they've had some really great progress with the EU. In fact, I attended a forum held by the EU about a month before Glasgow. And in that, Frans Timmermans, the executive director of the European Green Deal, he said that CCU is shaping up to have potentially just as much impact as carbon capture and storage. Now, that kind of thing doesn't happen without advocacy. And advocacy doesn't happen without money and without influence and power. And influence and power doesn't happen without investment and without social capital. So just trying to level the playing field for new potential disruptive technologies is something that I find extremely important in this, if we are going to get to a 2050 that is equitable and that is fair and just and prosperous for us all.
Now I'm going to be a little bit provocative with Sophia and say, you know, Australia, the smart country and everything like that. You're from far north Queensland, which has the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of the natural wonders of the world. We know it's dying. Right? It's being killed by global warming here. So, you know, we're talking the same cases with Costa Rica, this same issue. And then we have in the Galileo Basin coal mining, which, you know, and still it hasn't been put to rest the idea that they're going to develop even more coal mines in that region. You know, what's the community voice of you coming from that area? What can you do?
Thanks for that one.
I told you it was a curvy one.
No, I did grow up in paradise on the Great Barrier Reef, fishing and snorkeling, and it's one of the great wonders of the world. And it is something that should absolutely...
Oops. You're muted, Sophia. So we're going to have to hold that thought, Sophia, over there, while I zip through my other, you know, and if you do come on, just say something. You know, getting back to global, there's a question here about global prices on, you know, GHG emissions, issues around what's going to happen here, and the global pricing. And also another question, what do we see as the reason why the carbon emission trading market collapsed a few times? How can we avoid it? You know, so this carbon trading issue comes up again and again. So, gentlemen, I don't know who'd like to go first.
You can talk about the collapse, maybe, and I'll talk about the future, because you've been way more involved in the markets than I have. But I went to a couple of very interesting sessions on sort of thinking about how the global carbon markets might evolve. And again, Renat, you're right in the middle of this, I know. But we're not going to just have a global price on carbon. You know, that's not going to be set. It's not going to be, you know, we're not going to come out from Egypt COP27 next year and go, okay, it's you know, it's $42. So it's but there's some interesting thinking around how it might emerge. So obviously there's the EU ETS. There are other sort of collaborations across countries where they're starting to group and say, well, actually, sort of there's the work in the US across different states and the Canadian provinces. There's talk of, can we do something sort of, pan-Asia or at least sort of 2 or 3 countries across Asia. So there'll be then sort of hubs where there will be some...
Can you hear us?
Where there will be pricing in those hubs, and then they'll start interlinking. And so it won't be a perfect global market, but there will be there will be opportunities to arbitrage between the markets in that side, particularly on the voluntary market rather than the compliance market. And that's where we will start leveling up on a global price and how that will flow out. But you're the expert, so I'll stop talking.
Perhaps just quickly about the collapse. Yes, it did collapse. What was the carbon market back in the like 10 years ago? Yeah. Created under the Kyoto Protocol and the ETS. The root cause is actually quite simple. We had the double storm back in 2009. Yeah. Storm number 1 was the complete disaster in Copenhagen, where everybody thought the Kyoto Protocol was going to be extended, and then the whole conference completely collapsed. And the second disaster was the global financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009, and banks collapsing, and and also Europe went to a furious of recession. And just very logically, the way an emission trading scheme works is that you have absolute caps, and if there is a recession, your emissions go down, and that's where the price comes down. By the way, that's an argument why emission trading schemes are so efficient. They're anti-cyclical. When in a recession, carbon price going down, in a way subsidizing industry. In a boom, carbon prices go up, damping it down. So that's much more efficient than a tax, which is always the same. The problem is it's very difficult to explain that. I know in Australia, I remember, and I think Kevin Rudd, who might be still online, can sing a song about this topic. The Australians had an emission trading scheme, and the Tories simply called it a carbon tax. It wasn't, but they called it a carbon tax, and people voted the government out of the office for that reason. So my point is, we have a lot of explanation to do, and perhaps for starters, one thing I always try to do in such panels, carbon trading and carbon credits, they are better than the reputation, I tell you this. The one thing that carbon credits do, they create transparency. Yep. Each project we have is registered at the UN level or at the standard level. You can check each and every ton of CO2. Now, what does that transparency do? Every NGO and every PhD student can, of course, screen the database and look at everything. And guess what? You will find some problems here and there. Yeah. It's just the normal consequence of the transparency. But then our brains, when they see a problem, they go, oh, I could see there's a problem. I found one of 1,000 projects which had a problem, and that's why the whole mechanism is bad. So what it does actually, and that's really something I take quite personal, you're punished for being transparent. So sometimes if you just collected a donation and somehow moved it into some kind of projects, everybody would applaud because you can't check what happened. Yeah. As soon as you're talking carbon and you're transparent, everybody can check on you. So in this whole climate debate, I think we have to learn that we do make mistakes, we do make failures, but we want you to check. We want this mechanism to improve. We have to embark jointly on a global quest to risk more money, to do more projects, to learn from mistakes. Because if we keep sitting and just talking about targets, we're not getting there. So perhaps my most important point in this panel, let's notch up the level of risk-taking here. Let's not try to be perfect. Let's invest in companies like Sophie's. She's back on, I can see, that's great. and even if we lose some of that money, that's okay. We fail, we learn, and we improve. That must be the mindset if we want to manage this transition.
Look, if I can say something, can you hear me?
You're welcome, Sophia, and we're glad to have you back. It gave you time to think of a really good answer, right?
No, so I'll link a few things together. And Renat, I took so many notes while you were speaking.
Consider it your closing remarks, Sophia. So we're running out of time, so it's your closing remarks.
Are these my closing remarks? No.
Oh, don't worry. We'll give you some other time for closing remarks. Please go ahead. Yeah. No, there'll be a closing remark. I was going to say, we got our initial $9 million from the federal government in Australia in 2013. That was in a Labor-Gillard government where there was an emissions trading scheme. Now, this is one of the only times in history in Australia, or the only time where emissions actually reduced.
and there was funding from industry and from the government into clean tech. And so we were very lucky to receive that money then. But then because it had been called a carbon tax, the emissions trading scheme was repealed the following year, but we had locked in our funding. Now, over the following 8 years, we have been building our technology and have set our sights on locking away 1 billion tonnes of CO2 into usable materials by 2040, permanently and safely. And when I show people our plasterboard, and I say 50% of this plasterboard or drywall is emissions from Australia, and it's permanent, 10,000 years of storage. People think, wow, that's really cool. But the thing is that at the moment, it's still not that, not all carbon credits are created equal, right? There's permanence and carbon sinks to be considered. So the government in Australia have had a real political issue on their hands when you think about carbon taxes. And they say, look, technology, not taxes, is how we're going to get there. And as we are one of the technologies that may help them do that, we do say, wow, yes, technology is important, but we also do need some kind of mechanism to help innovation. So there's two things to say about that. One is that we're about to develop an ERF methodology in Australia for carbon capture and utilisation. So we will be generating Australian carbon credits through our government's fund, starting from halfway through next year. But the second thing is that with the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are being developed around the world, our country and other countries are going to have our exports penalised if we don't have very ambitious climate targets. And so that is a potential future cost on our country. But not only that, it is an opportunity for our country to develop low carbon exports that will become extra competitive compared to other countries. Now, there's the opportunity side of decarbonisation that I think Australia hasn't quite cottoned onto yet, but it is something that we could really be leaders in. And the problem is that climate change has become such a political issue from conservative to progressive that we've hit a stalemate. But potentially, we're about to have an election in the next 5 months in Australia, and I'm hoping for a good outcome for climate.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm going to have to apologise to the audience. I'm blaming you for drinking too much coffee before, but we can't take any more questions because we're really run out of time. But a final quick word from our experts to wrap things up. John, last time we finished with the key messages of your new book, Stories from 2030, but we can't do that twice. So can you think on your feet a little bit today? What's the next book you're going to write? What's the next theme? Is it going to be, 2050? I don't know. What is it? And
I was on the grants committee in 2013 that gave you the grant, by the way, Sophia. I'd forgotten about that.
We're not going to ask what that was about.
Yeah. What's the next book? I don't know. So there was at Paris, I launched a book on visions from 2100. What do you really want from a better world in the long term? This one's around stories from 80 people sitting in the year 2030, telling us what happened this decade. So the next one, I reckon, will be around 2040. But I think what it's going to build on is some of the stuff that I saw coming out of Glasgow. So some of my colleagues from the Deloitte Economics Institute have done what's the downside economic risk of not acting on climate. And so for Asia-Pacific, the numbers are something like $96 trillion loss, 12% of GDP by 2070, if we don't act. And that's locked in. That's the business as usual. And we can kind of build up from that. But the other thing I saw in Glasgow, which I think was really important, was how it wasn't just the NGOs and the unions and some of the progressive governments talking about just transition. If we don't do just transition, we will fail. It was the investors and the companies saying the same thing. It was also saying how if we don't integrate ecosystems and oceans and biodiversity and valuing natural capital, and the task force for nature-related financial disclosure was there, but if we don't integrate all that thinking into how we do climate, we will fail. So actually it's about broadening the horizon. So, by 2030, climate will be well underway. We'll be at, 45, 50% emissions reduction. We'll know exactly where we're going. We know what we're going to do with the hard to abate sectors. And then by 2030, we're going to have to start thinking really hard. We'll have to start before then. We'll have to action. How do we actually make this entirely inclusive and make sure that it is a just transition and that we actually end up with a better world?
Okay. Thank you, John. For Renat, my daughter wants to follow in your footsteps and study environmental science at ETH, and so she's one of the more optimistic ones about doing. But we heard from the previous panel, the issue. A lot of young people are seeing a lot of doom and gloom around the climate change. But what's your message, your advice to these younger generations?
So first of all, congratulations to your daughter for that choice. I can absolutely recommend the ETH and also environmental sciences, which...
David's nodding his head in the audience here.
It's the right thing to do. I think it's... First of all, to end here, something is very important to me. I'm scared of this doom and gloom. I'm really scared. Because one of the biggest fears is that all this energy that... Even my daughter is also on the street protesting, that when they then don't see the action immediately happening, that they would basically flip, and instead of being energized, they would just fall into despair. That's the last thing we can now use. We have to jointly agree, and perhaps what I put before, it's not everything is going to happen overnight, but we have great opportunities to actually make that transition possible. And to your daughter's ETH Zurich studies, I'm also a part-time member of the Swiss government's Innovation Council of Indo-Pacific. And that job gives me real joy, because I'm ultimately getting all these research proposals from so many startups in Switzerland, so many research conglomerates, so much power, so many people, young people who are going day and night, weekends, to research on a new patent, they have an idea, and it's all linked to decarbonization, to SDGs. There's such a lot of power, such a lot of innovation power in this transition, that I really hope that your daughter can actually not only study at ETH, but transport the message to her peers that, hey, it's not all lost. We're actually on it. We're researching on it. We're getting things done, and that she becomes a change agent for this more optimistic view of this can-do mentality that we now absolutely need. That would be my hope, and I hope that ETH will inspire her in that direction.
Thank you, Renat. I'll pass on the message, but also Sophia, who is, out there, part of that younger generation that is doing exactly what you've just described. So to wrap up for us here today, Sophia, what's your message to the audience, to us, the people who are, as they always say, in power now? What's the message to the people in charge?
So, last year I was at Davos. I was one of 50 young people who was chosen to present at the World Economic Forum with a white badge. And I presented on a panel called Building a New Carbon Economy. And in that discussion, or on one of the side discussions, one of the people in the room said, oh, yeah, we've all committed to net zero by 2050, but I'm pretty sure we'll all be dead by then. So how do we make sure that there's action? And I turned around and I looked and I realized that I was really the only person in the room that was still going to be working in 2050, not only still be alive. And so it's really clear to me that we need a diversity of voice and thought, and diversity in all respects, because there's different kinds of skin in the game. There's different perspectives that need to be considered. We need to be building a holistic society for a 2050 future that needs to be prosperous and equitable and all of those things. And without true diversity in the rooms, you're just not going to get it. I'm sorry. And what's one of the reasons why we're in this pickle right now is because I think there hasn't been enough diversity thus far. Now, in saying that, it's an unbelievably hopeful time. Like there's an explosion of innovation, of bright minds working on this. I really believe in my heart that the people who are committing to net zero truly believe in it and are committed to taking the action. So now it's about rolling up our sleeves, getting the job done, working together, and making sure we build something equitable all together.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And on that note, we're concluding this morning's event after Glasgow COP26 and the Indo-Pacific's quest for net zero. We hope you enjoyed this joint Swiss Re Institute and Asia Society Switzerland series on climate change in the Indo-Pacific. I would like you to join me in thanking our guest experts on this panel about opportunities for collaboration and finance. First, Sophia Hamblin Wang, joining us from Australia, COO of Mineral Carbonation International. Thank you, Sophia. Renat Heuberger, CEO of South Pole as well. And also John O'Brien, Deloitte's partner for energy transition and decarbonisation. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Also, thanks again to our other guests throughout the series, and particularly today, the Right Honourable Kevin Rudd, President of the Asia Society and former Prime Minister of Australia, and also Andreas Berger, CEO of Swiss Re's Corporate Solutions Division, journalist Hongqiao Liu, and Professor David Bresch of ETH Zurich. Thank you very much. Another great job staging the event by both the Asia Society Switzerland team, and that was led by my co-moderator Nico Luchsinger, and the Swiss Re Institute team of Andreas Berger, who's also wandering around there. A final thank you to you in our audience. We will be sending a follow-up email asking for feedback. Please be on the lookout for future events from the Swiss Re Institute and the Asia Society. For those of you here in Swiss Re Next Auditorium today, please stay and have networking and refreshments with us. More questions you can ask of the speakers we've had here today. To our online participants, farewell from Zurich.